Hi, everybody. Today I want to talk with you all about a topic that is a popular topic of discussion, and that's discrimination. Now, the word discrimination is an umbrella term, and I think we all can think of multiple types of discrimination, maybe some that we've experienced ourselves. When I say the word discrimination, what are the things that come to mind? Maybe it's discrimination against religion, or racism, sexism, discrimination against sexual orientation, perhaps. Ageism. There's a ton of different types of discrimination, some more popular than others, and I'm sure we can all make a list of tons of different types. But one that I want to talk with you about today is one that's really not so popular and is probably not something I would have really thought up off the top of my head, mainly because it's not something that I deal with personally or even know anybody who does. And that type of discrimination is the discrimination against the deaf or the hard of hearing. Now, some of you may know people, or you yourself might be hearing impaired, or know somebody who's dealing with that. And that's great because you'll really be able to understand what I have to say today. But I want to talk with you before I continue. I actually am going to ask you to think about a time where, and if you haven't experienced this, maybe imagine it, a time where you had difficulty communicating with somebody. Maybe it was a language barrier. Or maybe you just got your tonsils out and you couldn't talk. But imagine what it would really be like to not be able to communicate with somebody, not in the way that you can now. I bet the thought of that or the experience of it was probably frustrating, right? A little difficult at times. Definitely not that comfortable, right? Well, this is a frustration and a reality for many people who are deaf and hard of hearing today, and largely impacts the future of those people in the job fields. According to an article called Estimates of Wage Discrimination Against Workers with Sensory Disabilities, authors Marjorie Baldwin and Chung Cho actually talk about how employers' number one skill that they consider over among all the others is communication skills. And this is what they look at when they're evaluating current employees or considering potential employees. So where does that leave somebody who cannot communicate the way that maybe you or I can right now? Well, out of all the people in the working field, only 3.4% of those people are sensory disabled. So out of all those who work, only 3.4% of those are sensory disabled, and that's not just deaf people, that's also including the visually impaired. So less than 3.4% of the people in the working field are deaf or hard of hearing. And of those who are sensory disabled, including visually impaired and others, only make 71% of the earnings that their non-disabled counterparts do. So just as we see wage discrimination between male and females, that's a very common topic of discussion. There is a huge gap in the wages that are made in those who are deaf and hard of hearing and those who aren't. In addition to the wage discrimination, just their success in the job field alone is dependent on the fact that they can't hear or can't hear as well. In the same article that Marjorie Baldwin and Chung Cho actually are the first ones to make these estimates, they also talk about how those who are deaf or hard of hearing have less job stability, experience lower promotion rates, and actually have a high tendency to be underemployed in relation to their education and their work experience. Another article that I read called Fighting Workplace Discrimination Against the Hearing Impaired by author Gina Shaw actually talks about how these type of impacts in the work field impact both newer people graduating college, entering the work field, and even seasoned workers. According to the article, there are two different lawsuits that she talks about. And one of those is with a woman who was working with the company for 20 long years. And after 20 years, in 2007, they switched softwares where she had to go through training. She was unable to afford an interpreter to help her with her training, and the company didn't provide any accommodations. So her work actually began to suffer because she was unable to keep up with the newer changes. Because of her work suffering, that woman who worked for that company for 20 years ended up getting fired. Now, In addition to that, another woman who was involved in a lawsuit was denied a job opportunity because she could not afford and the company would not accommodate her with a full-time interpreter to help her with her training. Now, as unlawful that is, it is because those people are protected under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, it still happens. And according to Gerard Buckley, president of Rochester Institute of Technologies, under the National Technology Institute for the Deaf, actually claims that 250 to 300 new students are graduating from college every year who are deaf or hard of hearing and are looking for job opportunities. But with communication being the number one skill and them not being able to offer what we consider communication skills, where does that leave them? It leaves them in the 3.4% bracket of people who are making only 71% of what people who are their counterparts are making. And a big part of that stigma, that bias, is not always intentional. It tends to be pretty subtle. And in an article that I read called Reconsidering Sound and City by Gil Harold, he really talks and delves deeply into what is behind the bias of those who are deaf or hard of hearing. And the fact is, we just look at those who suffer from sensory disabilities as if they're in quote unquote childlike or less intelligent, maybe even dangerous. And when I think of it, and I hope you do too, you'll agree that it's disappointing and sad that we would make these discriminating biases against those who have put just as much work and education into getting where they are as we are. So thank you very much for your time.